Hello, my name is Stephen Denman. My organisation is Shining Guidance. My website is shiningguidance.com. I'm going to talk to you today about the emotional development of individuals who have autism spectrum disorder or ASD. Now, for those children and teenagers with autism spectrum disorder or ASD, they will experience a very wide range of emotions, and many of them need support to recognise and understand and manage in an effective manner those emotions which they are experiencing. So, for example, if a child with autism spectrum disorder, ASD, is feeling that they have emotions they cannot deal with, they may associate the idea of anger or rage as just being a general negative or unpleasant emotion that they'd rather just ignore and not really be in touch with on any level. Or they may not recognize that, for example, that they are feeling excited or happy. Or perhaps the autistic child or teenager might label all emotions that are hard to describe as boring and repetitive. So, those children and teenagers with autism spectrum disorder ASD conditions might also need support to recognize and interpret and respond in an appropriate and an effective manner to the emotions of more neurotypical individuals. So we really need to understand that for those children and teenagers that have autism spectrum disorder ASD conditions, they must develop a much clearer and discernible awareness of their own emotions and the emotions of neurotypical individuals. And this really is the first step to helping those children and teenagers with autism spectrum disorder ASD conditions to learn much more about emotions and to prepare them for adult life. So, how do we go about really looking at dealing with that, recognizing the emotions in children and teenagers of autism spectrum disorder or ASD conditions in an effective and focused and constructive manner? So we know that autistic children and teenagers might know the words for emotions, but still have trouble recognizing them in themselves and others, particularly when they're feeling very upset in a state there where they're emotionally and psychologically very stressed out. And of course, such individuals might also have a difficulty recognizing other people's facial expressions, their tone of voice, or their body language. So, what needs to take place is the facilitator, which can either be a parent or a trained and qualified and accredited teacher who's specifically focused in dealing with children and teenagers of autism spectrum disorder ASD conditions, is to actually encourage that child or teenager to describe sensations in their body whilst they're experiencing certain types of intense emotions. So, we need to understand how do these children and teenagers with autism spectrum disorder ASD conditions understand and accept emotions on a subconscious level. So we need to understand that they have to find a way to discern how they're going to tune into their own emotionality. And actually, there's a number of constructive methods by which this can be done. So, as part of understanding emotions, it is very important for the child or the teenager with autism spectrum disorder or ASD conditions to know that every human being experiences a complex range of emotions. It might also help those children or teenagers with autism spectrum disorder ASD conditions to discuss how intense those emotions are with you, but also you need to reiterate to them that those emotions will actually pass. They're not something that will last, for a very long period, and that they shouldn't become overwhelmed when they're experiencing those emotions. So we know that those strong emotions can be, in some ways quite overwhelming for autistic children and teenagers. And so, such individuals really need help with managing those strong emotions and finding methods to calm themselves down. And there are a number of different techniques that can be used. So, calming down children and teenagers of autism spectrum disorder or ASD conditions, can really be dealt with in a 5 step process. And that would be, for example, observing the emotion within the child or teenager, naming the emotion in the child or teenager, pausing and saying nothing whilst the child or teenager is experiencing that emotion, supporting that child or teenager whilst they are calming down from the intensity of the emotion and focusing on the issue that activated the emotion in that child or teenager who has autism spectrum disorder ASD conditions. So, there are various relaxation exercises that can be done. For example, they could go and do orienteering, they could go and do countryside walking, they could go swimming. Many different methods that can be used. Perhaps breathing and muscle relaxing techniques could be used. More basic sensory stimulation could be used, such as clapping of hands and whistling, and even aspects of dietary requirement can be looked at, such as drinking sparkling mineral water or drinking herbal tea, or maybe just going and meditating in a quiet, warm space in a garden, for example. So a change of activity for those individual children or teenagers who have autism spectrum disorder, ASD conditions, can be very encouraging, can be very beneficial to really developing their attunement to their own emotional states. And of course, ultimately, what may need to happen in helping these children really to attune to their own emotions and really understanding how they are interacting socially with other human beings, especially neurotypical individuals, is actually getting the right kinds of help for their own emotional development. So, an experienced professional can obviously help that child or teenager who has autism spectrum disorder or ASD conditions to manage and, in an effective and timely manner, resolve their sense of being overwhelmed at the experience of having that emotion in the first place. A good first step, for example, would be for the parent of that child or even a qualified facilitator, such as a teacher, to approach the general practitioner or GP, or perhaps a paediatrician, a counsellor, or perhaps a behavioural psychologist or other healthcare professionals who specialise in therapies that can actually effectively and positively and proactively help such children and teenagers that have autism spectrum disorder or ASD conditions to cope with their emotions, to process their emotions, and to be attuned to their emotions in the correct way and not feel like it's something they can literally suppress and not deal with in a positive and focused manner. So I think I've given enough information here on emotional development amongst children and teenagers that have autism spectrum disorder or ASD conditions. It's a very large subject, so it's not a subject you're going to really want to go into too much complexity over. But albeit to say, for those children and teenagers who have autism spectrum disorder, ASD conditions, it is really very, very, very overwhelming when it comes to dealing with their emotions, especially in a social setting with large numbers of other children and teenagers and adults. They find it very intense. They're going to find it a very difficult set of circumstances to be in, because obviously when they're obviously having to interact with those other individuals around them, if they're not able to read their own emotions and obviously to correctly read and understand and discern the emotions of neurotypical individuals in any social environment, that can be a very traumatic experience in itself. It creates a sense of estrangement, a sense of distancing, and obviously that's going to add to their sense of isolation, the sense that they're maybe dysfunctional, that they're different, they're the other, the outsiders, so to speak, in that situation, who don't feel they're fully supported or fully understood in any real effective and timely manner. And all of that can then lead to further mental health issues, such as obviously major depressive disorder, MDD. It can lead, therefore, to other aspects such as obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. It's a very difficult situation for many children and teenagers that have autism spectrum disorder, ASD conditions, to obviously process their own emotionality, to be tuned into themselves. So with all the vast amounts of incredible intelligence that the majority of children and teenagers who have autism spectrum disorder, ASD conditions have, the irony is being able to sit down and tune into their own emotions, and when they're feeling those emotions, understand them and know that they're only there for a fleeting moment, and it's not something that they need to be overwhelmed by or traumatized by, and to know there is a lot of help out there, not just from their parents or another type of facilitator, such as a qualified teacher or even a counsellor or behavioural psychologist. There's a lot of funding and different organisations out there, including charities, that can help them deal with tuning into their own emotions. So it's a fascinating subject, the emotional development of children and teenagers who have autism spectrum disorder ASD conditions. And I think I've really given as much information on this specific subject area as I can. I've certainly enjoyed presenting this information to you in the video. I'm sure you've enjoyed watching the information I have presented. There'll be many more videos to come in the near future. And on that note, folks, thank you so much for watching this, and I will speak to you all very soon.